Good afternoon and good evening from Pretoria in South Africa. Welcome to all for joining us for the launch of Defence Diplomacy and National Security Strategy Views from the South, edited by Ian Liebenberg, Dirk Kruit and Srikrant Paranjpe, and published by African Sun Media under the Press imprint. We are also happy to have the publication manager from Sun Media, Wikus van Zyl, and his colleague Michelle Meyer with us this afternoon. Please allow me to congratulate the editors, authors, and publishers of this very timely publication and this very important book. Before we proceed, a few house rules as a courtesy to our speakers, attendees, and participants. You will not be able to participate via direct speech, but you are more than welcome to use the conversation or comment mark function on the platform. We will do our best to tend to all comments and questions, time allowing, of course. But on to the business of the day. We meet at a time when a high-level South Africa SADC delegation under the leadership of SANDF Commander-in-Chief, President Cyril Ramaphosa, is visiting Mozambique to assess the recent events in that country. We know that Myanmar is still reeling after the military coup on 11 February this year. Elsewhere in the global South, China continues to flex its muscles on the high seas in the South China Sea and elsewhere. In Brazil, prior to Easter, President Bolsonaro fired his Minister of Defense, which was followed by the resignation of the heads of all branches of the armed forces, the first time ever in the country's history. All this and more during a global pandemic that requires us to reconsider the meaning of and the practice of defense diplomacy and national security strategy. A pandemic that also emphasizes in some instances and has deepened the donga or the chasm between the global north and the global south. These and other events remind us of the intimate and intricate link between defense, the military, politics, diplomacy, national security, and national security strategy. Defense diplomacy, as the authors have reminded us, remains a contested concept. Some scholars maintain that the purpose of diplomacy is communication and excludes any form, display, or threat of power. Others maintain that defense diplomacy is diplomacy sui generis and thus require a unique diplomatic approach. Similar conceptual divergence exists on national security strategy. Whatever the views we have expressed and have been expressed before, we have the benefit of having the editors and authors of this timely publication present to share their views with us. The editors anchored the publication in an introductory chapter followed by 13 chapters divided into three main parts: Latin America, Africa, and the Far East. The introductory chapter, and I will just give a brief introduction before I introduce the editors. The introductory chapter reveals the lay of the land for the editors. They take us through eons of political units and developments, outlining the impact and disruption of various forms of global colonial expansionism on historical and contemporary military and political developments across various locations in the global north and the global south. They stake a further claim on page 10, recognizing a need for a clearer analysis of global politics, specifically through a focused discussion on defense diplomacy of various countries and in the global south. On this note, please allow me and welcome with me the editors of this important publication and explain the structure of our conversation. First of all, Ian Liebenberg, editor, was at the time of writing associate professor and director of the Center for Military Studies at the Faculty of Military Science, Stellenbosch University. Previously, he was attached to the Institute for Democracy in South Africa as a director for research. He has also been attached to the Human Sciences Research Council of South Africa as a senior analyst, and he has been my colleague at UNISA as a lecturer in sociology. He edited and co-edited 15 works and wrote more than 100 articles, some translated in Russian, German, and Dutch. He has contributed to numerous reports between 1998 and 2018 and is the editor of a much acclaimed book, A Faraway War, Angola, 76 to 1988. Ian's research interests include ethnography, the Angolan War, Southern African politics, and liberation struggle. Ian is currently full professor in political studies in the Department of Political Administrative Studies at the University of Namibia, and he maintains his affiliation as extraordinary professor at the Stellenbosch University Faculty of Military Science. He remains also attached to the Center for Military Studies. Let me also sing the praises of Dirk Kruit, Professor Emeritus of Development Studies at the Faculty of Social Sciences, Utrecht University, Research Fellow of Center for Military Studies at the Military Science Faculty, Stellenbosch University, and then and this I can't say, Investigador Integrado Centro de Estudos Internacionais Instituto Universitario de Lisboa. I'm sorry, Dirk, my Portuguese has left me. He has conducted extensive field work in Latin America, thank you, Dirk, and the Caribbean. His research interests are civil-military relations, guerrilla movements, ethnic and class conflicts, urban violence, social exclusion, and informality. He recently published the book Cuban and Revolutionary Latin America, an Oral History. That was 2017, and he was co-editor with Kees Konings and Dennis Rogers of Ethnography as Risky Business, Field Research in Violent and Sensitive Context 2019. We are also truly honored to sing the praises of Shrikant Paranjpe, currently honorary adjunct professor in the Department of Defense and Strategic Studies at Savibrati Phule Pune University in Pune, India. He was a Jawaharlal Nehru National Fellow and professor in the Department of Defense and Strategic Studies, and contributing authors, director to the Chavan National Center of International Security and Defense Analysis at the Shravibati Phule Pune University. He was a Fulbright Fellow at the George Washington University in Washington and a visiting professor at Colorado College, Colorado Springs. He has published several books and articles in the area of security studies and international relations. I would also like at this stage to introduce Professor Andre Dupassani, who is also part of our panel. Andre is Emeritus Professor of Politics at the University of Namibia. He has published widely on security, democratic theory, Namibian politics, and the political economy of the Southern Africa Development Community. Andre has been engaged in the work of the Southern Africa Defense and Security Network since its founding in 2001. Andre is a polymath. He's a published poet, photographer, and a researcher in rock art in Namibia. Please allow me then also to start with the structure of our conversation. We start with a conversation with the editors and Professor Dupassani. Then we move on to questions and comments from participants. To start our conversations, I would like to invite each of the editors to reflect on how this publication came about and why the focus on the global side. Ian, as the lead editor, can I ask you to please start with your comments on this, and then we can take it to Dirk and to Sriwasti. Thank you.
Thank you, Jansi, and thank you for being our facilitator, chairperson, and discussion leader. It is really wonderful to have you as a very well published person as well in various areas on board, and we're honored to have you. A little bit about the book. I met Professor Shrikant Paranjpe quite a few years ago, I think circa 2012 or thereabouts, 14, at a conference that was held in Tanzania. So we met in Dar es Salaam. And we discovered that we have the same interests in terms of security and issues around diplomacy. Obviously, he's an expert in another part of the world than I am. So yeah, we at the time didn't have the idea that the book will come out of it. And in 2016 in Rio de Janeiro, I was so fortunate to run into Dirk Kruit, at the International Sociological Association, or shall I say, Dirk ran into me, and it was wonderful. We immediately clicked and discussed this issue, and from our view, one of the big things around publications currently on contemporary international politics or global politics, what we called in the old days international relations, was suffering and is still suffering from a very strong northbound gaze. People look at Europe, they look at the United States of America, uh, Canada, and so on, and then Russia comes into the picture. While we have on the globe rising powers and very important powers in what I would call the global south, which was pejoratively in the old days, as we know, by Western political sciences called the so-called third world. But via a long history of the non-aligned movement and up to where we are now, I think we soon discovered here's open space for a book. It's time to stir a bit of a dialogue, bring a few new ideas into the picture on the global south. Needless to say, I contact Shrikant immediately because the working relationship and the friendship was there, and it was really wonderful to have them as co-editors. There's nothing as a big privilege is to have two people that are very amenable, they're bright, and they can cooperate instinctively. And that's my story about the beginnings. I'll leave it to my colleagues to give their impression.
Thank you, Ian. Dirk, do you mind pausing?
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, I'm very honored to be invited to be the editor, basically on the Latin American countries. It was, as Jan mentioned, in Rio de Janeiro that we started to think about it, and immediately we became friends. And with an interest in defense, in diplomacy, in the old field of international relations. Although I'm Dutch and I was raised in Rotterdam and Utrecht, I spent most of my professional life in Latin America, both in the Spanish and in the Portuguese-speaking country. Well, there is only one Portuguese-speaking country, but it is a subcontinent. So I can call myself a Latin Americanist, and I found it always strange that most of the books we had to read in Brazil, in Peru, even in Argentina and in Mexico, were translations from American and British publishers. Although there exists solid networks of people interested in the military, in the political side of the military, of the security forces, of the guerrilla, and the transformation of the former guerrilla movements into political parties, some of them with success and others with well, the long way to nothing. But it was an enormous, well, how do I say it? It's a challenge to be able to be confronted with the African reality, the Asian reality, what I knew was reading journals, and it was the first time in my life that I really could do comparative studies with the two other large continents and with Russia. And I'm immensely grateful. I learned a lot of it.
Thank you very much. Shrikant, please share with us your insights and your experience of the process.
Sure. Thank you, Anis. Let me confess that the original idea of initiating a kind of a study on Global South was Jens, and it was his brainchild, and he suggested, why not we do this? It's an excellent idea, essentially because you see, coming from South Asia, or I think that would be experience of countries of whether it is Latin America or Africa, we tend to focus more on either the Americans or the Europeans or the great powers or the superpowers, and very little material, if anything, academic material is available about countries' foreign policies, countries' security strategies of countries of Latin America, of Africa, of Asia, because very little work is done in this area, which is why I was really very impressed when Ian said that this is something that can be done. Given that idea, I think when the structure was originally made, the three main areas, defense diplomacy, strategic resources, and national security strategy as a focus area, that also made a lot of sense because these are really, in a sense, integrated into the perspectives of each of these countries. Automatically, you look at the political aspect of it, the socio-cultural aspect of it, the historical aspect of it, and you get, by and large, a holistic picture in terms of how these countries are going to look at the world, their worldview, and so on and so forth. When you're looking at the way in which the book was eventually structured, I'm quite sure Ian and Dirk would have liked far more countries represented into this book. Probably, who knows, we might do another volume with other new countries. What I was particularly impressed was, and Dirk, this is essentially with reference to your works, civil-military relations, problems of internal conflict, problems of internal security, all this, which is otherwise not dealt with in defense, these things, automatically come into this book, automatically come into the understanding of these dimensions when you look at simple things like strategic resources, simple things like defense diplomacy. These countries which we are looking at are not powerful countries. But even though they are not powerful countries, in the sense that they are not great powers, they do have a role to play in terms of defense diplomacy. So we are charting out new areas, and I think the whole purpose of the book was this, and I was very happy to work. And Dirk, you and Ian, I was really happy to work with you. Probably I was very bad in terms of communicating things done.
No, not at all.
But anyway, this is what I would say initially in terms of. But it was a nice experience, and I'm quite sure I would be most happy to expand into new countries. Again, Global South, that is a necessity because very little literature is available. We are fascinated only with great powers and superpowers. We need to look at Asia, Latin America, and Africa far more actively and in a more systematic manner than what is being done really. But thank you. Over to you, Anis.
Thank you very much, Shrikant. While we have you, can we please ask you to give an overview of the chapters, each of you, and some of the main findings. But before I give you a chance, Ian and Dirk, I'm so grateful that what happened in Rio didn't stay in Rio, and that you shared it with us. Shrikant, can we please ask you to give an overview of the chapters that you were the editor for, some of the main findings, the things that stood out for you, the new information? Thank you.
Sure. I was mainly looking at the Indian side, and that was the main area. One chapter was on military diplomacy, and this was by Masleker. What he argues in this, and it makes a lot of sense, what he argues is, he says, look at India. India wants to talk of strategic autonomy. And when you're talking of strategic autonomy, you automatically tend to reduce any kind of a military partnership with other countries. That becomes a constraint. Further, he says, and it makes a lot of sense. The Indian political and administrative leadership is not very keen, or is rather um, rather hesitant to use the armed forces for diplomatic purposes. It is use of force, the whole concept of use of force. How are you going to use force? You might have defense capabilities, but are you going to use force in terms of diplomacy? And traditional Indian thinking is that, well, this is something, the idea of using power is something that Indian mindset is not really willing to really indulge into. Essentially, therefore, if we are looking at Indian military diplomacy, we would have to really go back to look at the Indian political and strategic ambiguities which exist in the making of the Indian mindset, to understand whether it can be used or not. So using military instruments of power is something which is being questioned. Second article which I was looking at was by Ajay Lele. He's looking at managing India's strategic resources and reserves. Strategic resources are something which any country would really be keen to exploit, essentially, if you're trying to talk of yourself as becoming a relatively bigger power. India has evolved over a period of years. It is evolving as one of the major economic power. It is evolving as one of the dominant military power in this region of Southern Asia. It is talking not only of immediate Southern Asia, it is talking of greater South Asia, which would include West Asia, East Asia, etc. If you are doing that, and this is what he's trying to argue, if you're doing that, then you have to have adequate reserves and resources to have some kind of a capability which is going to be developed. It is two things. There are two things. One is the current government is talking of making India in terms of trying to evolve some kind of a self-sustaining system. At the same time, we are also opening up for foreign direct investment. In fact, increasingly in opening up for foreign direct investment. Both these things taken together, and there is no contradiction in this, but both these things taken together, focus on strategic materials is bound to become critical. We are importing a lot of things, and this is part of the problem which we will face. Third is an article which I had myself written on India's national strategy. It flows from work which I've been doing in terms of India's strategic culture. That was a book which is published. Essentially, the argument there is that when you're looking at India's national strategy, you have to look at it from a more holistic point of view, and not simply in terms of capabilities and capability analysis, etc. Look at India's history, look at geography, look at its civilizational perspectives to understand Indian strategic culture. I remember Ian teasing me when I said there is a deliberate ambiguity in India's strategy, and that there is a utility to deliberate ambiguity whenever one talks of India's strategy. But let me still continue to say that India continues to talk of deliberate ambiguity as one of the key aspects of, strategic autonomy, yes. India is far more actively participating in world affairs. It is far more actively willing to use force where necessary. And some of the instances are very, very clear nowadays. But at the same time, utility of this deliberate ambiguity has not been really given up. Argument is the basic difference between a Western perspective in terms of national strategy or security strategy or doctrine and an Indian perspective, which I have always said it is civilizational, is that we don't go by a mathematical calculations of ABCD as a doctrine. We go by a philosophical perspective to say that, look, this is our worldview, and it is that worldview within which one would talk of a strategy and a doctrine, etc. We will not go into ABCDs of a doctrine. We will keep, that is where the ambiguity comes in. And that is the argument which I've been making. But I was essentially focusing on the Indian side. I would have liked, and I would still like eventually, Ian and Dirk, if you're thinking of that, to look at the other countries of South Asia, equally important, whether it is Pakistan, whether it is Bangladesh, whether it is Sri Lanka. These are very important countries who need to be looked into. And I think that is something which I might request you to consider, Ian. you are the motivating force in all of this. But thank you.
Thank you, Shrikant. Ian, if you can give an overview of the chapters that you were specifically responsible for.
Okay, we actually started off inviting a few more countries, and sadly we only ended up with chapters from Zimbabwe, Namibia, the Republic of Namibia, and South Africa. Now, it's very interesting in that comparison, you find Zimbabwe that has moved from a liberation struggle into a very, very, very short-lived, if you could even call it that, multi-party democracy, and soon fell back into authoritarianism. Yet it's contributing its role in Africa in terms of soldiers for peacekeeping operations and so on. Yet under its previous president, there was a clear presidential agenda to keep Zimbabwe rather apart from, for example, a country like South Africa. On the other hand, with Namibia, and Andre will say something about it, Zimbabwe and Namibia grew closer to each other. The interesting thing that for me about the other two cases is we have a country which is perceived to be one of the giants of Africa in terms of South Africa. And South Africa moved from a very aggressive stance under apartheid, projecting its military power hundreds of kilometers, if not thousands, into Africa. And that transition to a democracy and the acceptance of the South African Constitution, Act 108 of 1996, in Chapter 11 specifically took note of where we came from, namely an authoritarian state, and prescribed the roles and the duties of the defense forces and the security forces. For me, it was important progress. And it's also on that I think South Africa found itself coming back into Africa, aligning its both foreign policy and its defense diplomacy with the rest of Africa. Now, let us be dead honest, South Africa was a new kid on the block, and we were not always very popular for trying, because there were South African political leaders that went around preaching to others. And it was not always well liked. I can relate to the book that you mentioned, The Faraway War, which we published on the war in Angola, South Africa's role there, the Cubans, the Russians, SWAPO, the liberation movement of Namibia. And I remember on a visit in 2007 to Angola, the Minister of Arts and Culture, which we visited, and we met their Chief of Staff and so on. But jokingly, the Minister of Arts and Culture said, "We are more than willing to work with you on this book, but please kindly do not bring your imperialism here." And that was a very stunning way of how South Africa not always realized how it is perceived by our neighbors. Nonetheless, I think South Africa is playing an important role in Africa in terms of our contribution to peace operations. And there are more and more expectations, which is the other question which vaguely was addressed in one of my chapters. And that is, I'm not sure that South Africa can live up to all that expectations. And we will have to become quite a bit more humble and accept that things lies in teamwork. But I want Andre to say a
Yes,
few
please.
words on the Namibian case,
Yeah.
because having him here is actually such an honor and a pleasure. He have to say a word or two.
Please, please. Thank you very much, Prof. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Ian. Thank you, Geransi and Dirk and Chirac. I'm very privileged to be part of this wonderful journey called the book on defense diplomacy and national security strategy. Just speaking very personally, my sociology of knowledge has always been to look at security and look at foreign policy and their interfaces in Southern Africa. And that's not just because of the 12 or more years of the SATSEM Southern African Defence and Security Management Network experience, but it's also intellectually very critical because of the politics of knowledge. I think all of us have already emphasized the primacy of the voice of the South, the global South, to be heard in terms of forming the conceptualization of issues and also providing policy foci around these debates. So I'm very interested in the politics and the sociology of knowledge. Namibia is a very instructive case for the following reasons. First of all, it is by all accounts a small state. It's not a big state. It's not even vaguely approaching the status of a middle power. It's a small state. It is wedged between the two wounded giants of Southern Africa, Angola and South Africa. And I think that's very important in the psyche and the mentality of Namibian policy and Namibian foreign relations, but also in terms of its defense diplomacy. That realization the country is actually part of the region, but it's wedged between these potential giants of Southern Africa. And then, of course, it's the product of an extensive, protracted national liberation struggle that culminated in a former national liberation movement capturing the state in 1990 under very special circumstances. Let's not forget that 1990 was globally a major shift, a major transition in global politics. The end of the Cold War, the fall a little earlier on, November 89, the Berlin Wall, the unraveling of ideology as a driving force in international relations. So the Namibian case study is especially instructive. It's a small state trying to build a number of core bilateral relations around which it anchors its diplomacy, and that being essentially principally, in our case, Germany and South Africa, the two core bilateral relationships. And then it tries also to be multilateral, joining the regional bodies, joining, of course, the UN, and trying to conduct its defense diplomacy within the corset of the broader global framings around peace and security, and of course, particularly in our case, SADC, Southern African Development Community, and the African Union. So for all those reasons, the Namibian case study is very instructive, it's very interesting. It contrasts in some important respects with South Africa, also with Botswana, who didn't have the liberation history, for example, but is also a small state. But it's also conceptually interesting because the people who captured the state were the very ones who actually were the motor of the liberation struggle. And their mentalities are especially interesting to explore because by the very nature, the liberation struggle was internationalized. And SWAPO, as a former liberation movement like the ANC and ZANU and ZAPO and the MPLA and many other examples, Frelimo and Mozambique and so on, were international actors. In our case, long before independence. So Namibia brought with it that, if you want, that history or some would say that baggage with it at independence, being a product of international solidarity, of the UN in particular. So it took quite liberally from the different currents of ideology and thinking and conceptualization of policy. Let's also remind ourselves that it was under UN auspices and with principally the role of the United Kingdom, as we all know, who created the Namibian Defence Force as a kind of amalgam of former South African linked elements and the former clan, the People's Liberation Army of Namibia. So it's a kind of syncretic model of how civil military relations work. And I think for all those and other reasons, if I wish to elaborate, the Namibian case study is really useful. It's a very interesting one. A small state making a successful transition to democracy, to independence, institutionalizing the military as one of the first state elements and first state institutions, and building what was called the politics of national reconciliation. Again, the link with Zimbabwe is important. So indeed is the link with the ANC in South Africa. So in short, that I would say would be a very rough and ready impressionistic summary of some of the elements in the Namibian equation. And like small states and like many Southern African states, Namibia is also trying to play the bigger powers off against each other. And is looking east to China particularly, also in terms of procurement and equipment. And initially, immediately after independence, our brother from India will be very happy to know to India. India was a very, very important player in providing training, providing equipment, and providing doctrine and strategic thinking and calculus to the Namibian Defence Force. And then, of course, Brazil, in terms of the Namibian Navy. So again, for all those reasons, I think Namibia actually fits nicely within this framing of the book. And hopefully the chapter will bring out some of these subtleties and nuances. Thanks, it's a great pleasure and an honor to be here, and of course to be invited to contribute to such a splendid publication.
Thank you very much, Professor. It's always such a pleasure to listen to you and to read your work. And thank you for pulling all of that together for us as one of the authors of a case study. Thank you. Can we move on to Dirk? Dirk, can you please share with us the chapters that you were, I guess it's Latin America you indicated earlier. What are your impressions of the Latin American case studies?
Yes, thank you. The Latin American armed forces have the countries of Latin America, with the exception of Brazil. Brazil was a question of a Portuguese dynastic choice. The son of the then exiled king of Portugal declared himself emperor, and the empire lasted until the last part of the 19th century when the army took over. But in the other countries, most of the liberations were army were armed forces, and in the popular imagination, the army has the kind of birthright to act as an arbiter or to intervene in domestic affairs. And after the period of massive dictatorships in Latin America between the late 50s and the early 90s, all armed forces had to cope with the legacy of dictatorship. Most of them right-wing, some of them leftist nationalists. In many of the countries, it meant an enormous reduction of army budgets, army new training programs for cadets and young officers. For instance, Argentina, with the double trauma of dictatorship and the lost war against Great Britain, couldn't find enough cadets for the new generation of officers, and it took some time to convince a new generation of young adults in a combined training program between the Army, the Navy, and the Air Force. That is the basic pattern. Other countries, and the two largest one, and that is seemingly no, not the two largest one, but the two most violent one, Mexico and Colombia, didn't have coups. They had enormous internal wars. Some of us would use the term civil wars. Colombia has an armed force, an enormous armed force, just somewhat smaller than that of Brazil, that is already 60 years engaged in counterinsurgency operations. Mexico has an army already 25 years operating in counterinsurgency operations, basically against mafias and drug cartels. And it is interesting to note that the case of Colombia had just one coup during a year and a half in the 90s, and another coup and more or less a beneficiary one for 3.5 years, and that was the only coup in the history. But all other countries have some latent sense of choosing between internal and external defense diplomacy. The external diplomacy is to participate in peace operations. It's, the former dictatorships and the former counterinsurgency armed forces strongly reduced, opened schools for United Nations operations, Brazil, Argentina, Chile, Colombia as well. Then there is another phenomenon. It is mentioned in 2 or 3 of the case studies, and that is the kind of osmosis between the unitary political power, Nicaragua, Venezuela, Cuba, and not recently, but a year and a half before, Bolivia as well, in an osmosis between army, economy, public sector, and political party. And that is the one of the phenomena that is still functioning as well in Latin America. In general, although the budgets and the volumes of the armed forces are strongly reduced, the diplomacy for external use is peace, and for internal use is, a peaceful coexistence.
Thank you very much, Dirk. That sounds a fascinating part of the book. Also, thank you very much. We have a question from one of our participants or our attendees. And just a reminder to all the attendees, please put your questions for us. We have the editors and one author with us so that we can make benefit of that, or use benefit of that. We have a question from Christian Engelbrecht. He asked, what are some of the fundamental truths in terms of the field through which all the editors have spoken through, the groundwork for the book? What was its catalyst? Can we please start with any of you that are willing to take on this question? So what are the fundamental truths through which all the editors have spoken through, the groundwork for the book? What was its catalyst?
Yes, thank you, John. Let me say a few words, and then I think my colleagues will contribute also their view. For me, the initial driving force was I'm a strong believer that everyone should have a voice. And over the years on the globe, there were many voiceless people, many voiceless countries, many voiceless states. And the second thing was that I had a long-standing interest in what happens when you have a global situation where you find a self-appointed world policeman that increasingly interfere and sometimes even at own will sort of in a very ad hoc way and sometimes in a very aggressive way. And what intrigues me is how long could this last? And will it last longer if there were no voices or are no other voices? Or will it last shorter? So for me, there's the two elements. The one is people should have a voice and countries should have a voice. And remember, during the liberation struggles, if we think about the non-aligned movement, and there India again played an important role, and Cuba, a smaller country, played an important role. And there was, after the 90s, a sort of a lapse in the non-aligned movement.
Yeah.
And to an other extent, people focused, and I think importantly so, but to an extent, with too much stress on BRICS, as if there's nothing outside BRICS. So if I can answer Christian, I would say that there were various urges or drives that brought it together. On a very, very human level obviously, the pleasure to know Shrikant and Dirk, and we're from 3 continents. And just knowing their views, the urgency with which they write, the seriousness with which they write. So the human element cannot be taken away. And as I see this book evolving, I could not imagine the book with them involved. So I trust on that 3 levels, of which the one is just pure, the common core of humanity and co-being and Ubuntu, as we would say in South Africa. And the other is having space for a voice and pushing that space consistently.
Thank you very much, Ian. Shrikant, would you like to add something to that?
Well, I would start by saying working together with Dirk and Ian was an experience with itself, and I think that is something that I would cherish and repeat definitely if necessary. That is the real human part. At an academic level, when you're why this study, what was the source of this? When we're looking at the whole concept of global South, the argument is we are looking at kind of post-colonial societies. We are looking at these societies in terms of how they are looking at the world, evolving their policies in the changing world order, especially post-1990s. And what are the challenges that they face? What are their aspirations? Can we really understand these aspirations from their perspectives rather than a Western perspective? That was really the whole interesting point. And to me, I mean, my knowledge of Latin America or Africa is very, very, very little. To me, personally, reading through what the book itself was a very educative experience. And I would always like to do such things, because these are things which is a continuous process of learning really. But thank you.
Thank you very much, Shrikant. Dirk, we look forward to listening to you.
Exactly the same. First, it was a pleasure. And being a pleasure is half of the quality. The 3 of us could work together very easily. Jan was the senior editor. For me, it meant, although I spent so many years in Latin America, I really had forgot that there existed other continents, and probably I had ingrained the idea that northern countries and editorials were right in explaining how other countries worked. And it was a surprise learning from other subcontinents and countries and larger and smaller countries of Asia and Africa. I have to acknowledge it was a learning process as well.
Thank you very much, Dirk, for that. And what I like about your synergy is the energy with which you have done this work and how you have motivated one another. And then, of course, as Ian says, to give a voice to the voiceless and the production of knowledge. We have another question, this time from Robert Hicks. Thank you, Robert. Robert says, a great initiative, well done to all involved. Probably, he says, one of the greatest examples of defense diplomacy in Africa was the establishment of the Sea Power for Africa Symposium, which was set up in August 2005 and helped shape the maritimes of Africa. Based on the biannual International Sea Power Symposium, which is seen as the second most powerful leadership globally, second only to the UN. And he asks, any comments? I suppose, Ian, this may be up your alley, but we are welcome Shrikant and Dirk also to have comments. Ian, would you like to start with this one?
Thank you for the question, and thank you for the compliment by Robert, in that it is a good book. I do think from the side of Southern Africa, there is a weakness in the book that we did not look well enough at the maritime dimension. And I think this is increasingly a dimension that will become important. Now, it is true that for quite a while, people are working on it. If you think about the Security Institute for Governance and Leadership in Africa, you look at some of the work done by the Institute for Security Studies. And I think one of the strengths in Srikant's contribution is that he looked at the naval aspects much more than we did. If I have a self-criticism, I would say we were a little bit army orientated when we looked at relations between the state, the government, civil military relations, civil control over the military. And I guess that unconscious bias came perhaps from what happened under apartheid. Apartheid was not a naval era. It was an era where people fought on the ground, and aggression were projected aggressively all over Southern Africa, with obviously the Namibian people and the Angolan people suffering the brunt of the destruction. And especially Angola still suffering from the consequences of that war. No, and I think to conclude on that question, I think this initiative by African states is probably for our good, and it augurs well for the future. Because remember, none of the states in Africa can equal, either in defense diplomacy or in a defensive capacity, enough to work to defend themselves, or if we want to use the word, to brag to the rest of the world in making diplomatic friends and so on. And I think the initiatives around the maritime are very important. And Srikant said we're going to work on another book. Srikant, from my side, to the questioner, I think I will work. We will get someone to also something very good on the maritime aspects.
In fact,
can I just for a moment let Andre say something here, and then we'll move on.
Sorry, Srikrant, we will get to you right now.
Thank you very much.
Please, Andre.
Thanks, Robin, for that very important question and observation. I think it is true to say that some very innovative work has been done, particularly in Mozambique, on African perspectives on maritime security. And I particularly refer to the work of Professor Paulo Coelho, who is really renowned in this region and beyond, not only being a novelist, but also really exploring and fleshing out the debate around maritime security from an African perspective, for example, by including the primacy of coastal communities in such a discussion, and more recently also in foreign policy development in the region. The whole construct of the blue economy has emerged as a very cornerstone of many of the diplomatic initiatives of countries in Southern Africa. So I would go along with Ian and the other colleagues that this clearly is a lacuna in the book that that calls for perhaps another book or another set of chapters.
Thank you very much, Andre. Srikrant, can we get your
very
feedback?
small, a very brief comment. The very recent, the so-called small incident at Suez has brought to light the kind of problems that we might face in terms of maritime issues.
Yeah.
But initiatives in terms of the Indian Ocean, initiatives about maritime security and maritime problem issues and cooperation, definitely, and if we are going to do something else, maritime issues would be an important element, an important chapter that we would have to look at. Essentially, maritime security issues, how and in what way things have to be perceived. And as you made a mention of South China Sea, for example, in your introductory remarks, these are challenges these are maritime challenges. And in an Indian context, for a very long time, we had been land oriented in terms of our security. We started to look at the Indian Ocean very late, in fact, only after 1970s. And we are now doing it more seriously. But yes, maritime issues have to be looked at as an important area.
Yes, and Srikrant, what I like about your selection, although you criticize it, of course, as editors, one tend to afterwards look at, yes, it's a good product, but we could have and we should have. But what I like about your selection is that these are states from the global south, but you have a member of the UN Security Council as a case study. You have nuclear power as a case study, a country that has given up its nuclear power, nuclear weapons. You have a space power in the form of India involved here. Some say, India is also a cyber power. So you have a good selection of countries from the global south that can hold their mettle against the global north. And yeah, for me, that has been one of the values of your publication, is that you have been able to have all kinds of states with all kinds of power from the global south that you have looked at. But you have set yourself up, of course, the three of you as editors, is you have published with a publisher that says as its motto, challenge accepted. So either you go for another publisher, or I suppose you stay with this one, because they have also set you up with this motto of theirs. Colleagues, we have reached an hour. There is one more question, and if we can use the last, say, 5 to 7 minutes that we address this question, and then I think it's time for a few concluding chapters. This one is by Sandile Ndlovu. Thank you, Sandile. He says, broadly, how do you define defense diplomacy? A very important question which we have not really been able to go to the core, although there's been some references to that. Sandile says, especially because there is a difference between defense, military, and security as concepts. He asks a second question: can the sale or trading of defense equipment also be considered as part of defense diplomacy? And then finally, Can a country like South Africa take advantage of its unique position in the area of military capabilities to advance South Africa's defense diplomacy? And let me also take a question from our anonymous attendee. I think that's the last one. How do you see the role of the Global South in global politics in the future? I think that's a very good point to end up. Once again, Ian, if we can start off with you, because there is a reference to South Africa, and then also we take a round robin from all the rest of the editors. Thank you very much, Sandile, and the last questioner. Thank you.
Yes. Thank you for the questions. The first one, defense diplomacy is a very interesting concept, and if you read through the work, one will discover that it sits between the diplomacy and the foreign policy of a country and the way it can project power, either peacefully or aggressive power. And defense diplomacy in numerous cases are playing that role of assisting foreign policy, but through soft options. And in terms of imaging or marketing a country, it can also be used where necessary in soft diplomacy to use a sort of show of force to say, listen, we are aware of what you're doing, and we can react in different ways. So for me, it straddles that tricky area between foreign policy studies and the study of defense policy per se. And when we say defense diplomacy, I think the politics plays a role there. What is the nuances? How does different countries make use of their diplomacy within a specific context and under which specific conditions? There's for me a very interesting question that I would definitely would like my fellow authors and co-editors would like to say something also. But for me, the very important question of the global south, what do we see if we try and look into a prism for the future? I think the global south, and this book brought it out, they are not necessarily like way back in the time of the non-aligned movement, that they had a common economic view, namely anti-capitalist, that they had a very strong anti-colonialist approach. I see a diversification between the countries in terms of their interests, how they balance their interests, with whom they interact, and why do they interact. And I think there's very little doubt that, at least in my mind, that we're going to see a decline. In fact, that economy has been declining for many, many years, the United States of America. And a declining economy, I hope I'm wrong, but I see the United States becoming much more aggressive militarily because of its economic decline. Because how else are you going to upkeep your status and your profile? So in a certain sense, and one could see it, Trump was the interlude, but just after Trump went, America basically went back to its prescriptive foreign policy as it did for dozens of years. What do we see in the place of that? Hopefully, much more broader spread of power, much more balance of power, much more multipolarity, and hopefully, in terms of some of the things that Shrikant touched on, a worldview which says, but we're not only living in a world of anarchy, there's also the possibility of the world of cooperation. And I'm not only meaning institutional, the classic liberalist paradigm of institutions will have to solve all the problems. I'm also thinking about countries, moving closer, searching for solutions, etc. Obviously, it's complicated by numerous things, but I will not take too much time of my colleagues here. But if I can use the word, if we can see an evolving new balance of power globally, that would in some other way contribute to more peace on the globe. Then I think what we try to do with the book has been a small contribution, but hopefully something to reflect upon and move forward.
Thank you, Ian. Shrikant, do you mind following up on that, please?
Two things following what Ian has been saying. Defense diplomacy, yes, defense diplomacy is essentially a political decision making. You use your military power, you use your capability, but the final decision in terms of how to exercise that is a political decision. It is not a military decision, and that is the distinction which we made in this. As for the other aspect about global south, I follow along what Ian has been saying. We are not trying to color all countries of the south with a single brush.
Yeah.
We are going beyond NAM in that sense, beyond non-alignment.
Yeah.
In fact, each of these countries has its own independent identity, shaped by its own history, culture, tradition, whatever, but also shaped by where it is located, what challenges it faces, what are its perspectives in terms of development, how it looks at the world. And therefore, these countries have an individuality which have to be really understood. At the same time, they belong to what could be described as a global south, that there is a commonality there with which they cannot escape. So it is this mixture that one looks at when one looks at global south. But
thank you, Shrikant. Dirk?
Very few things. Yes, Jan told us, I agree as well with Shrikant, and it is absolutely clear that there is a slow but steady reordering of power on favor of the global south, and it is evident as well that the demographic factor, masses, will count and will count much more than they did.
Thank you very much. Colleagues, I'm mindful of the time. There is a comment still. I'm going to ask you if you have time to perhaps directly interact with the editors. I see it is Petrus de Kok. Petrus, we are a little bit tight on time. I think let's call it a day here. Ian's dogs have been barking. So I think it's not the wolf at the door or the bailiff or the sheriff in town. Let me just say in conclusion a few things. I want to thank all of you for your time, not only the attendees, but of course the editors and especially Professor Dupassani also for sharing with us the origins of your book, your thinking behind it, and also the hard work and the enthusiasm that went into this labor of love while you were also producing knowledge. You were also giving a voice to a part of the world that is so important. I heard a few things that spoke to me is that changes are afoot. We don't know where we are going, but there is a new balance of power emerging. Whether it is in our time, whether it has been induced by the pandemic, we have seen that in the making. We don't know exactly how it will play out, but your book has at least opened up and our eyes for a world that is in the making. I've also heard from you that there is a strong link between state pathology and how a state projects itself on the international scene. I've read this book the last night, speed reading. I may be wrong, but what I also see from your chapters is that there is a strong agency that is already evident and in the case studies that you've mentioned, which is of course very positive and aligns with this view from the South, this voice from the South that you have given. Ian has referred to the complexity of the international order, so have the other two also. We sit with the UN Security Council, a UN that is a 1945 model. Nothing wrong with being vintage, but we know that you can only go so far in a 1945 model. We also know, for example, that within societies, the demographic factor that Dirk referred to will change the balance of power, not only within states, but also in neighborhoods, etc. Shrikant, you have reminded us of the civilizational aspect of it. And of course, what I also picked up from you is that we have to be mindful of not seeing these continents that you have spoken of as monoliths. But the civilizational aspect is surely an aspect to be taken into cognizance. We have seen that the Bandung consensus is no longer the talking town. We are moving to something totally different. There is a new consensus developing, while at the same time, as all of you have highlighted, there is also a very distinct identity amongst these states in the global South. What remains for me to be saying is to thank each of you for your scholarship, for your leadership, for your inspiration for us, and also for thanking you for your time. And we wish you to have a very successful publication to such an extent that it may bore you or inspire you, or both, to present us with a next installment on this topic. And I'm sure that we can look forward, and this is a humble request to Sun Media to assist in this process. Thank you once again to everybody that participated. Thank you to Vikas van Zyl in the background, Michelle Meyer in the background, and thank you everybody. And I hope that you will go out, buy the book, read the book, use the book as a discussion point, and yeah, let's talk about this as part of the conversation of humankind. Thank you very much for your time, and a good evening, good morning, and a good afternoon to wherever you may be. Goodbye.
Thank you, Anis.
Very much.
Thank you, all of you. Thank you, Sun Media, for the publication and arranging all of this.
Lovely meeting you, Dirk and Shrikant and Ian.
Same here.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
It's been a pleasure. And good luck. Stay well.
Thank you. Thank you. From our side, thank you very much, Joansi. And thanks for the nice questions. And I've seen some nice compliments here from people like Petrus de Kok and Francois Frey and so on. Hello, guys. And it was nice to know that you are there. Thanks.
Yeah, your next responsibility you should be very clear about.
I am very clear about it.
Challenge accepted.
And I think I know pointed the fingers, so we'll have to go, Shrikant. And that
Thank
will
you.
be there.
Goedenavond.